Ladies and gentlemen, to have a better understanding of the situation there, we're joined from Cairo by the International Relations Specialist, Dr. Mohammed Osman. Dr. Osman, welcome to Q News. Saying of steps would make a ceasefire durable now in Gaza. The releases, phased withdrawals, verified access, and which element of those must happen first to unlock the others?
Thank you for having me, Hani. Of course, to begin with, we have to stress that this plan is far from perfect. If anything, it's not even a good plan. However, it is the only achievable and workable arrangement given the current circumstances and the current balance of power on the ground. So for this ceasefire to be implemented, to begin with, Hamas has to respond positively to this initiative despite its shortcomings. So this is where we should begin. The Palestinian resistance factions have to accept this plan, and even if they have their own reservations on it, they should be taken into account. However, they cannot be to the detriment to the application of this plan, because as we can see, Israel is very eager to weasel its way out of this plan and has made it clear, and the United States told them that if you find some sort of loophole that you can evade any commitment to the plan with, the U.S. will not stand in your way. And of course, any Palestinian non-acceptance of the plan will trigger that immediately. So it is essential that Hamas accepts this proposal and interacts with it and responds to it positively. But of course, the implementation mechanism will need to be reviewed thoroughly and also applied afterwards, after it is formulated. Just today, the Egyptian foreign minister said that the plan could be workable. However, always the devil is in the details. And it is true, because now a certain timeline has to be worked out for the release of the detainees. And of course, 72 hours is not remotely realistic. And also at the same time, the phased withdrawal of the Israeli army of occupation has to be set in stone in an established timetable agreed upon by all the parties that are involved in this agreement. And Mr. Netanyahu has made very dangerous remarks, saying that we will stay in Gaza for a long time, that we will control the majority of the Gaza Strip on the long term. And of course, this contradicts even what President Trump has announced in his proposal that has been posted. So the phased withdrawal is very important, and also the efficient and serious commitment to the reestablishment of the flow of aid from Egypt into and Israel, of course, into the Gaza Strip per the provisions of the agreement, the ceasefire agreement of January. And the Trump plan clearly stipulates that according to this mechanism, aid will be re-entered once more with the right quantities, at least 600 aid trucks a day. And of course, so this is what needs to happen, Hani, in order for a ceasefire to be enforced and eventually sustained. And this will open the door to the idea of reconstruction, to the idea of future governance, to the idea of even a long-term settlement of the Palestinian cause. All of this hinges on the application and the implementation of a ceasefire.
Well, let's start with Hamas accepting the deal and the timeline of it. Now, the White House unveiled the 20-point plan and issued Hamas a 3 to 4 day ultimatum. Now, in diplomatic terms, does an ultimatum help or hinder consent-based bargaining? And how might mediators then sequence the engagement before the window closes?
Of course, in terms and the context of this conflict, of course, and the crisis in the Middle East in general over the past 2 years, we have seen that ultimatums usually backfire and deliver the opposite results or the undesired results, unfortunately. So this kind of rhetoric by President Trump and the U.S. administration does not help and does put into question again their credibility as a mediator. They need to be balanced, they need to be less critical of the Palestinians, and they need to be to apply more pressure on the Israelis. However, nothing hardly indicates that the Americans are really willing to do that. If anything, President Trump in the press conference told Prime Minister Netanyahu before the entirety of the world press, telling him that if they do not respond positively to this agreement or to this proposal, then you have the green light to finish the job, meaning resuming the war of genocide in Gaza, which is still ongoing, by the way. We need not forget that this war is still ongoing and hundreds of people are still dying every few days. So this is something that we have to take into account, and Israel is seeking to create new realities on the ground. However, on the other hand, Hamas needs to ignore such American threats and actually be moved by the national interests of the Palestinians. And this will require Hamas to present more sacrifices, more concessions. If that means that Hamas will have to be out of the picture of governing Gaza and also eventually disarming, this is something that is essential and a necessary sacrifice that needs to be undertaken in order for the implementation of this arrangement and this agreement. If Hamas refuses to disarm or refuses the main provisions or the core provisions of the American proposal, and unfortunately there are indications that Hamas will respond in such a manner, this will be to the detriment of this proposal. It will actually kill it in its cradle, unfortunately, and it will only justify further Israeli aggression and the furthering of the Israeli vision, which is basically the completion of the annihilation of Gaza, and possibly even pitching the ideas once more of displacement and depopulation, bearing in mind that the current agreement prohibits the forced displacement of Palestinians. And this is a big win for the Palestinian side, given the dire circumstances we're in. So therefore, Hamas needs to be more responsible, Hani.
Well, the core planks are quite familiar. They reportedly include an immediate ceasefire, the phased-out Israeli withdrawal, detainee exchanges, Hamas disarmament, and a transitional, internationally led administration for Gaza. Which of these is the real gatekeeper concession that determines whether the rest would be workable?
I think that the idea of an international oversight over the Gaza Strip, it is not the best idea in the world. If anything, I do believe that it basically sabotages the authority and the legitimacy of the Palestinian Authority, which should be automatically restored as the governing force in the Gaza Strip. However, there seems to be an Israeli-American veto on that, unfortunately. So if the concession is that there needs to be some sort of international form of governance, a board of peace led by President Trump himself, and that has a multitude of members, including Tony Blair, who is rumored to be the de facto governor of Gaza if this goes into effect. If actually this takes place with commitments that Palestinian rule under the Palestinian Authority will be restored in the Gaza Strip eventually after a transitional period, then I think that this is a necessary compromise that we will need to accept as part of the assurances to the Israelis, and also to soften the Israel's stance on the Palestinian Authority. And on the other hand, the Palestinian Authority needs to accelerate its internal reform, which has been mandated by this agreement and many other agreements, actually, in order to strip the Israelis and the Americans out of any justifications to evade their commitments under this agreement to restore full Palestinian rule to the Gaza Strip. I know it doesn't sound good. I know it is unacceptable. I know I find it very hard myself as an Egyptian and as an Arab and a sympathizer with the Palestinian cause to concede to the idea of Gaza being governed by such a body. However, this is a must. And at the same time, there are guarantees. There will be a presence in the governance and the maintenance of security by a multinational force, which includes Islamic and Arab nations. So this means that this is not entirely out of the realm of the Palestinian and the Arab whole, that we have a say, that we have a presence in this form of governance, no matter how flawed it is and no matter how flawed the entire arrangement is. It still beats the duration or the endurance or the perpetuation of the bloodshedding and the genocide in Gaza, Hani. It definitely does.
Well, you've mentioned that the Israeli offensive is continuing. The hundreds are being killed as we speak. So is it possible to find a way to insulate the humanitarian access, the medical evacuations, food pipelines from battlefield dynamics? What concrete safeguards would prevent aid as leverage?
This can be provided if the Israelis agreed to it. Previously, there were humanitarian corridors, and theoretically, there are still some humanitarian corridors, and there are humanitarian zones, like the area in Al-Mawasi. However, the Israelis call them humanitarian zones and describe them as safe zones, and at the same time, they target them and bombard them on an almost daily basis, causing a multitude of civilian casualties. So that's the thing. Is the Israeli behavior needs to be reined in. The Israelis need to be contained. They need to be brought under control. And the only means by which this could happen is through substantial American pressure in order to establish or re-establish these humanitarian mechanisms that will ensure the entry of humanitarian aid or the unimpeded flow of humanitarian aid, even if the conflict continues for a few other days or a few other weeks, which is very plausible, by the way, Hani. So I think this needs to be established as parts of the efforts to impose or implement this agreement. However, this requires the United States to apply actual pressure on the Israelis on each and every detail and to be on board and to actually express their genuine will to enforce this agreement. If the Americans are not serious about enforcing it and will leave it for Israel to choose or elect whether to apply this agreement or even commit to it selectively, then this will be a recipe for failure, Hani.
Dr. Osman, the draft lacks a clear path to Palestinian statehood, according to several accounts. Now, in negotiation theory, can a temporary cessation succeed without a credible political horizon, or does that simply defer the next cycle of violence?
Of course, it does defer to the next cycle of violence. It's just as if it's freezing the conflict. You know that always the idea of freezing conflict has always been associated with the former Soviet spheres. I think that now this concept is being transformed into the Middle East and to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. There is an attempt to freeze the conflict along the current line somewhere or the others, which are favorable to the Israeli side. And they think that with time, maybe the Israelis are bidding on that, or Netanyahu's government is bidding on that, that with time they can create certain realities in both the Gaza Strip and the West Bank that will negate the idea of the establishment of a Palestinian state. And I think that this is what the Israelis are aiming at. And unfortunately, I think that the Americans are on board with this Israeli vision. However, if the Americans really want to invest in actual peace and a durable peace in the region, they will need to reestablish a path towards the two-state solution and revive the peace process once more. The two-state solution is what has been agreed upon by the international community. It has international consensus. The U.S. itself has agreed to it decades ago, and it cannot retroactively retract this agreement or this pledge or commitment now. And the international community itself, and it is also established by international law. So attempting to subvert that and ignore that and deny the Palestinians their legitimate rights to self-determination and to the establishment of their state on the borders of June 4th, 1967, while taking into account Israel's security needs, if this does not happen, then this will be a recipe for future conflict. And that is why Israel is pursuing genocide, Hani. That is why Israel is pushing for ethnic cleansing. It wants to definitively deal with the crisis by their own final solution, inspired by the final solution of the Nazis, by eliminating Palestinian existence in historical Palestine, unfortunately, Hani.
Yes, well, given the domestic politics in Israel and fragmented authority within Hamas, what are the most realistic confidence-building measures, if any, that each side could adopt in the first 72 hours to demonstrate compliance without appearing to capitulate?
I think this is impossible. I think that at some point both sides will have to capitulate on some of their terms in order for this agreement to be applied. The Israelis, of course, are giving compromises by abandoning the idea of imposing total control in Gaza, reoccupying Gaza or establishing security control over Gaza, and pushing forward the idea of displacement. This of course, will be taken off the table with the new arrangement of the agreement. So this, of course, will be a huge blow to Netanyahu and will harm his standing with his far-right allies in the governing coalition, or even it might lead to its collapse. And on the other hand, of course, Hamas will basically, if they agree to this agreement, they will basically be agreeing to exiting the entire Palestinian equation, and they will exit the scene. They will disarm. The formations will disband. They will be granted amnesty in order to leave the Gaza Strip. That means no more Hamas within Gaza. These are very drastic compromises that need to be taken by both sides if there is an urge for peace. There is pressure on both sides to achieve that. The families of the detainees in Israel are pressuring the Israeli government to agree to the agreement to save whatever is left of the detainees and the hostages, 20 alive and about 18 dead. They want 28 dead. They want them back. And this is, of course, is causing a lot of pressure on the Israeli prime minister. And on the other hand, the Palestinians, of course, are worn out by the war. They are suffering from war fatigue. They are suffering from the dire humanitarian consequences of this war and from Israel's blatant violation of international law and commission of ethnic cleansing, mass murder, and genocide. So they are pressuring Hamas as well to accept, because they want an end to the war and the bloodshed, in an effort to resume any semblance of a regular life without people getting murdered on a daily basis, and the restoration of the most basic services and the most basic needs through the provision of humanitarian aid and the beginning of early rehabilitation and reconstruction. So both sides are under insurmountable pressure. However, if both sides decide to act irresponsibly, whether the Israeli occupation or, unfortunately, Hamas, then this war will continue.
Mm-hmm. What about the financial aspect of it? What financing architecture could tie compliance to early recovery? Escrowed funds, pay for performance milestones, or a Gaza reconstruction facility? And who should audit procurement to prevent diversion?
It seems that the Trump plan has covered that as well. They have proposed the idea of creating a global fund for the reconstruction of Gaza. This is somehow in line with the Egyptian vision for reconstruction, which was adopted and endorsed by the Arab League, by the Islamic Organization of Cooperation Organization, and also by the international community at large. So everyone supports the Egyptian Arab Islamic reconstruction plan, and I think it can be applied under the umbrella or through the funding of this international fund or global fund that President Trump wants to set up as a method by which funds can be gathered for the rehabilitation and the reconstruction of Gaza. Gaza will need about from $60 to $70 billion in order to be restored to its pre-war state. Raising the rubles will even take months and years. So reconstruction will be along an arduous process that will require stability, Hani, that will require complete cessation of hostilities and a stable form of governance in the Gaza Strip, whether international or local. So I think that the idea of reconstruction, it needs to be preceded first by an established ceasefire, a durable ceasefire. The ceasefire has to stand the test of time. The Israelis have to begin withdrawing from parts of the Gaza Strip. The multinational forces need to start redeploying along with the Palestinian police who are being trained in both Jordan and Egypt, and also, of course, the Palestinian Committee, which will be under the oversight of the International Board of Peace, or this World Board of Peace led by Trump, needs to also take up the responsibilities inside the Gaza Strip. Bearing in mind, of course, that this Palestinian Committee and this Board of Peace, the Palestinian Authority will have representation in those committees. So they are not completely out of the picture, of course, to the disliking of the Israelis. Yes. However, all of this cannot be implemented without the Israelis owning up to their commitments under this agreement.
Yes, well, Dr. Osman, bear with me. Now, if a pause transitions to a longer cessation, what security arrangements in Gaza would be viable? Interim multinational presence, for instance, Arab-led policing support, restructuring, restructured local forces under external monitoring. What would work then?
I think this is what is being actually proposed by the Trump plan. A multinational force, the redeployment of Palestinian police trained in Egypt and in Jordan. And of course, this Palestinian police is part of the forces of the Palestinian Authority one way or the other. So this, of course, establishes the legitimacy, the de facto legitimacy of the presence of PA forms of governance in the Gaza Strip. And the multinational force, of course, will be there, which will be, of course, Arab and Islamic-led, according to many sources, will be there as a guarantor, as a party that is acceptable to both the Israelis and the Palestinians. These forces, when they enter Gaza, of course, these are Arab and Muslim forces, so they will be welcomed by the local populace. They will not be seen as a force of occupation, as opposed, for example, if we bring in European troops or American troops, for example, which will be viewed with distrust and viewed as occupiers, basically, which could be the recipe for a whole new other level of conflict. So I think that all of these arrangements combined are important. However, central to it has to be the intention and the goal of re-establishing full Palestinian control over the Gaza Strip as soon as possible. These arrangements of international governance and multinational forces and whatnot, these are temporary solutions and should be very short-term. They should never be long-term, and they should never be applied in perpetuity, because this will basically be removing the Gaza headache from the Israelis and throwing it upon the heads and the shoulders of the international community and the Arab and Muslim world. And this is something that is unacceptable under any circumstances. Gaza is part of the Palestinian territory. That is part of the state of Palestine that is now recognized by over 159 countries all around the world. And therefore, and since the Palestinian Authority is the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people that is recognized as the legitimate government of the state of Palestine, their control eventually has to be restored over the Gaza Strip after, of course, reform and rehabilitation.
Mm-hmm. What about the Palestinian feeling of the man on the street? I mean, what's your assessment of the current balance of power within Gaza, particularly between a fragmented Hamas and other local factions?
I think that the average Palestinian in Gaza just wants the war to end, Hani. He doesn't care, he or she does not care about anything else. They do not care about multinational forces. They do not care about Tony Blair. They do not care about this. They do not care about that. What they care about is that the bombs stop dropping, that they stop losing relatives and their children and their neighbors and their friends and their own lives. They have to stop being injured. They have to stop living in tents and moving all around and being chased by Israeli tanks and soldiers and drones on a daily basis, that they find a stable source of sustenance and food, that they will find shelter, that they will find medicine, that power would be restored, meaning electricity and water, basic services. This is what the Palestinian people in Gaza at this point, who have been worn out and fatigued by this war, seek to attain at this moment. They do not care about anything else, in my opinion, Hani, at this point.
Well, with the recent suspension of the Red Cross operations and the worsening famine conditions, how close is northern Gaza to a full-scale humanitarian collapse?
It is within the premise of a full-scale humanitarian collapse. Most of the deaths by famine right now are in northern Gaza. No aid is reaching northern Gaza. Northern Gaza is being now annihilated by the Israelis, especially the city of Gaza. Just today, the Israelis announced that the Al-Rashid road, which was open for Palestinians moving in and out of northern Gaza, has been shuttered, and now it's only allowed for the Palestinians to leave northern Gaza to the central and southern parts of the Strip, and they are not allowed to go back, just like at the earlier phases of the war. So at this point, the Israelis seek, apparently, before a ceasefire comes into effect, to achieve as much territorial control as possible inside northern Gaza and Gaza City, and to annihilate as much of the city as possible, because in my opinion, Hani, I highly doubt that they will withdraw from northern Gaza. I think that northern Gaza has been promised to those Israeli settlers and those crazy Israeli right-wingers who maybe could be a part of a secret deal between Netanyahu and the right wing, that they could retain or resettle northern Gaza in return for agreeing to such a plan. And of course, because this plan is so, even though it is very clear in some aspects, it's very incoherent about its details. There's a lot of fog within this area. It's very foggy. So at the same time, this opens the door for Israel to weasel out of many of its commitments and create certain realities on the ground that can be tolerated, unfortunately, by everyone else for the sake of ending the war.
Yes, well, the casualty in Gaza now amounting to 66,000 and rising. But what then are the main obstacles preventing aid from reaching the most affected areas, trying to stop this rising death toll? And what diplomatic or logistical measures could unblock these channels?
Israel. This is the main obstacle, Hadi. Israel is the one preventing the entry of aid. Israel is the one stifling the entry of aid. The Strip needs about 600 to 700 trucks daily in order to attain or achieve a state of basic sustenance. What is being allowed, for example, through Egypt, through the Karm Abu Salim border crossing, it never exceeds 40 to 50 trucks a day, and sometimes they are as low as 18 and 15 trucks, and sometimes they do not enter at all. And from the other 5 crossings between Israel and Gaza, even less and less aid enters on a daily basis, and some of these crossings are completely shuttered. Israel is using hunger as a tool of war, as a weapon of war, in order to exert as much pressure on the Palestinian populace as possible. First of all, for them to stop harboring Hamas or to turn on Hamas, and we are seeing this trend grow, unfortunately, now. Now the Israelis are recruiting local militias among the criminals and the mercenaries of the Gaza Strip to fight Israel, to fight Hamas in certain areas like Qnews, like the vicinity of Rafah, and even now in Beit Lahia in the north. We have 3 pro-Israeli mercenary militias from the ranks of the populace of Gaza. So this is the situation that the Israelis want to impose. And of course, the areas that are controlled by these militias or by the Israeli forces are the ones that aid is allowed into, basically. However, areas that are still under de facto Hamas control, they are deprived of any of the basic aid. And of course, the suspension of the Red Cross activities, and also the persecution, literally the persecution of UNRWA, a UN specialized agency, and the murdering of over 300 of its personnel and the destruction of its facilities. This is a means by which to eradicate the entire humanitarian distribution mechanism that is acclaimed and recognized internationally. And of course, it has been replaced by the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is basically another vehicle of intentional starvation and genocide, which is basically one of the foundations of the crime of genocide, unfortunately. And unfortunately, the Americans are implicated in implementing this mechanism. So the restoration of the internationally recognized humanitarian process of aid distribution and entry is essential to alleviate the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and the famine and stop the deaths.